What's up, sound painters? In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about the phase of composition, which I refer to as preparing the palette. And for me, this is probably the most essential and fundamental and consequential stage of the compositional process that you're going to have. I have found this to be true in my own works, and I've seen this in other people's music as well. So basically what you're going to do, the very first thing that you should be doing is listening to a ton of music. Because just like we've established in the past lessons, if we want to be able to establish our own theoretical vocabulary and compositional vocabulary, we need to be very good listeners and we need to be observant of what other composers are doing. So we're going to be listening to a ton of music relative to whatever style, genre, period, or instrumentation we happen to be writing for. So if you happen to be writing flute music, for example, then you should be compiling lists of all of the different flute pieces within that style. So let's say that it's contemporary concert music, like what I do. So you should be looking for all of the composers within that genre that are contemporary who are writing for the flute. So you would then search their names in YouTube or SoundCloud or wherever. You can even do this like on social media and ask people like, hey, what's your favorite flute piece? I'm doing some research and I'm just trying to figure out what has been written for this instrument. What are your recommendations? And people will send you stuff. Not all of it's going to be good, but it's just going to give you a very good sense of what is possible on the instrument. You can compile these lists. You may have bookmark folders full of different links in case they're in different places. I tend to make YouTube playlists just because it's all in one place and it's easy for me to find, and I label them based on the instrument. So I'll have a flute playlist, I have a string quartet playlist, I have a bassoon playlist, I have, different playlists, orchestra, whatever the case may be. And this is just helpful for me to then, whenever I'm writing for that instrument, go back and see what the sonic possibilities are, because there really is a lot of stuff out there. And so while you're doing this listening phase, you should also be keeping a listening journal. So I know I mentioned this in the past, but this is going to serve as a documentation of many different things. One, the kinds of formal things that people do, so you can just make notes of how pieces are actually unfolding in time. You can say it starts with these elements, and then there's this climax in the middle, and then it ends here. These are the things that this composer happens to explore in multiple different pieces. It doesn't have to be super academic. It doesn't have to be super analytical. It's really just making observations that you can then analyze and interpret later. It's also going to help you to be able to establish what the tropes of the genre are. So if it's flute writing, for example, there are going to be certain things that a lot of composers explore because they're sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of timbral things that are exciting. And there are going to be things that maybe you don't like that composers do. Maybe you really hate when people do lip pizzicati. I mean, this is very subjective, obviously, but maybe this is just something that you just absolutely cannot stand. So this would be something that you make a note of. You say, 10 composers that I've listened to in the last 30 minutes all do lip pizzicati, or they all do singing and playing, or they all do, what would be even worse is if they all do it in exactly the same way. But if you weren't doing this kind of listening analysis and you weren't actually taking notes, you may not make these observations, and you might actually fall into the trap of using the lip pizzicato or singing and playing in the way that you actually can't stand. And then when you hear your piece, you realize it just sounds like every other piece that uses those techniques. So that's why I recommend using this, is because it's going to get you closer to what you actually want to do, and it's going to filter out the things that you don't want to do, which is even more important. It's also going to give you a very strong sense of the sort of timbral borders or timbral limits of what people actually explore with certain techniques. So let's take singing and playing as an example. There may be certain limits that people tend to explore with singing and playing that you feel that you can actually broaden in the piece that you're going to write for, depending on the performer you're working with, because they happen to be really talented at singing and playing, or because there are just certain ways that you've found to combine different flute techniques with the voice that are more exciting and that explore it to a much greater degree than you've heard in the past. So these would be things that you start to establish in this listening phase. Then once you feel like you've filled up this creativity well of a lot of different ideas based on this listening phase, you can start to actually write down ideas. And I see that there are two basic ways of preparing the palette when you write ideas down. The first would be inside time, and the second would be outside time. And so basically all inside time means is the ideas are going to be specific to a particular trajectory, either rhythmically, melodically, harmonically, whatever the case may be, inside time. And so this is actually where most composers start, is they start sketching with rhythms, with notes, with harmonies, and they tend to conflate this phase with the actual composing of the piece. And sometimes that ends up being true, but a lot of the time, because they sort of understand this as the phase of actual composing, then they get married to the idea, especially because it's really difficult to generate something from scratch this way. And so they have a very hard time making changes to it because they don't really want to mess up all of the hard work that they've done. So if you start to just reframe this as compiling materials because you want to understand where the piece lives, then it's a lot easier to then trash the idea or completely transform the idea or cut and paste and put it somewhere else. Then that just gives you a lot more freedom and it detaches your ego from the results, and you're able to just have a more healthy, positive relationship with this phase. That's why I refer to it as preparing the palette inside time, because you're generating materials that are ideas that are going to feed the actual piece, which you're going to compose later. These are just sketches. So this is something that visual artists do as well, right? So if you ever go to a museum where they have an exhibition of, let's say, Picasso, for example, a lot of the time within the exhibit, there will be rooms where they show sketches that he did for larger scale works later on. So you'll be able to actually see the compositional process, the workshopping phase, before the actual piece was done. And this is just a way for the artist or composer to be able to establish where the piece lives. That's sort of the metaphor that I like to think of, is like these sounds have their own life, they have their own energy, and we just need to figure out what the context that they exist in tends to be, how they tend to behave within this context, and that's going to give us a much greater freedom for being able to control certain trajectories within our music. That would be the first option, generating materials or preparing the palette inside time. Outside time basically means things which are not necessarily tied to a specific trajectory. So you could think of like a scale. A scale exists outside time. It's just an abstract concept, or a particular rhythmic idea can exist outside time. Now, obviously, in the case of rhythm, it's tied specifically to time, but you can have rhythmic fragments and you can have lists of fragments, or you can have certain kinds of pulse patterns which exist as abstractions outside of time that you can then create sort of a bank of options with, and that bank of options would then feed into the actual piece later. You could also think of like timbral possibilities or timbral combinations as existing outside time, so you can just create a list of all of the timbral combinations that you have between the bassoon and the horn and the oboe, for example. You could do like a flutter tongue multiphonic that then is overtaken by the horn doing a flutter tongue singing and playing, and then there's like a percussive like whatever on the oboe afterwards that cuts it off. That would be like one thing, next thing, and sort of just create a list in this way. If you have multiple instruments and multiple sounds that you're interested in exploring, and then those become sort of your bank that you start to draw from when you are composing. You've already sort of generated these ideas outside of time, outside of a particular trajectory, so that composing is easier and more efficient. I've done this in my own music. So for example, in my cello music, I've done things like make lists of different kinds of scordatura tunings, and then once I decide on one of these tunings, I would say, well, what are the different harmonics, for example, that I can do on any given string? And then can I combine harmonics in multiphonics? If I can, which ones can I combine? And these are going to be obviously, for the most part, on adjacent strings. So then I just create a compilation of all of these ideas. So in the notes section below the video, I'm going to include a PDF to just show you exactly what I did in my cello piece. And that way you can start to do this in your own music. So preparing the palette outside time can be many, many things. It can be these kinds of lists of timbral combinations. It can be lists of harmonic possibilities, of specific techniques for a particular instrument, for specific chords, specific filters. So you can say, if it's a cello, tremolo, legato, staccato, spiccato, jette, or ricochet, whatever you want to call it. Different scordatura tunings, the different things that they can do with pizzicato, the different chords that they can do, and certain positions of the instrument. So it can become pretty overwrought and extensive. So that's where having like a particular principle is actually really, really beneficial. And when I say principle, I mean something that helps to funnel your ideas in a particular direction. So let's say, for example, I want all of these sounds to be high, or I want all of these sounds to be low, or I want the sound trajectory to be mostly high that goes down to the low register. So that's going to start to make you think about, well, if I'm going to write in the high register on the cello, what are the kinds of sounds I want to use? Well, I want to use mostly pizzicato sounds, and I want to use mostly harmonics. That's a very specific thing that's going to help you to start making a list of all of the possibilities that you can do that are mostly high, mostly pizzicato on the cello. And then you can say, well, it's mostly pizzicato, so that's going to give me some options to use the bow. How can I still maintain this overall texture of short, percussive, dry sounds? And then that's also going to help you to funnel the idea in a particular way. What if I want this to be really loud, really high, really dry, short sounds, and I want a string quartet to be able to do it? If you established in the listening phase that you're writing for string quartet, then that would also give you a lot of possibilities, and that would also encourage you to think more about certain rhythmic trajectories or rhythmic textures you can create. I already am thinking about this just by talking about it. So it just helps you to concentrate by placing borders around certain ideas. So you can use these principles in outside time sketches so that you can think, well, if the instrumentation is string quartet, then I want everyone to be pizzicato, or I want everyone to be doing arpeggios all the time, or I want everyone to be doing arpeggios, but they can't play the same bowing, or they can't play the same rhythm, or they must be at different points of the instrument all the time. You can do this inside time as well. If you say, well, I want the overall trajectory to be loud to soft, or soft to loud, or noisy to clean, or clean to noisy, or whatever the case may be, this is just going to help to funnel the ideas in a particular direction. And again, this is preparing the palette, meaning none of these materials really have to have any consequence on the actual piece that you're writing. You might actually write, if it's inside time, the same exact section later on in the piece, but if you're just thinking about it as a generative process where you're experimenting with what the limits of the idea are, then you're going to feel a lot more free to really just play and workshop and just think of it as a sandbox where you can explore and build castles and destroy castles, or bury things in the sand that you will forget about and never explore again. This has happened to me as well. And you have to sort of allow yourself that freedom to just play. That's why this phase is so important. And don't feel limited to just focus on one thing. If you feel that you've explored as many chords as you can, then try to prepare the palette with something else. Think of timbral possibilities. Think about rhythmic possibilities. Think about pulse patterns if you're writing pulse-based music. Think about certain kinds of, if you're writing for strings, think about like contact points. Think about bowing possibilities. Think about pizzicato possibilities. Think about what you can do with 3 instruments versus with 1 instrument. Think about orchestration combination possibilities. Think about, like, in terms of orchestration, you can have all instruments playing at once. You can have ratios of 3-to-1. You can have 2-to-2. You can have 1-to-4 or whatever. And when I say 1-to-4, I mean like oscillating between a soloist and the quartet. And so there are just different ways that you could work this out. So just thinking like about all of these different things at different points and then recombining them at a later phase is going to make the materials more rich. And you're going to have a lot more colors to actually be able to work with once you actually start composing. So that's sort of the next phase. Once you've established this preparing the palette phase, once you have your list of materials, the next thing that you're going to do is start to brainstorm how to categorize these things. And one thing that really helps me, which may help you, is to actually create a visual representation of them. And I'll just like show on the screen what I've done in the past. So like in my string quartet that I wrote about 5 years ago, for example, I had sort of like visual categories for the different sound types. And basically it was like a trilling sound or a sustained sound. And they're very simple visual representations. And then when you start thinking about like, how can I develop this idea? You just start drawing different things that represent like distortions, for example, or different kinds of orchestration groupings, or maybe you want to mix these two things, sustains versus tremolos. This would be something that using a visual can be really helpful for. If you're less visually oriented and more like verbally oriented, you could also use verbal descriptions of these things and say just tremolo or just sustain. And then how can I develop these two word groupings? And that would be one way to work with it as well. More sort of like storyboarding and storytelling compositional processes. That's something that I'm also always trying to do, is break down the barriers between different artistic disciplines to see what I can draw from cinema or dance or the visual arts or whatever medium I'm interested in to help me to make my music better, to make the compositional process more efficient. And that's what I would recommend for you as well. So whatever works the best for you to be able to think creatively and to access ideas at a higher level conceptually, I would recommend that you do that. and incorporate it into your compositional process. And if you're not sure how other artists are doing things, then maybe just seek that information out. Look at interviews of your favorite artists. If you have a particular writer, see if there's a book of interviews, or see if they wrote about their compositional process somewhere. See if you can find this information. There's so much on the internet at our disposal that we are almost always going to be able to find this. And if you can't, then there are books that you can find on creativity that might actually help you by exposing certain things. There's books on writing, there's books on the visual arts. Artists of a certain stature tend to do interviews. So you can find interviews with like Francis Bacon or Gerhard Richter, or you can find interviews of Martin Feldman talking about his process, or you can find things like John Cage talking about his compositional process or his visual arts process. All of these things are going to feed into how we think about what we are doing in music. And so seek those things out, and that's going to help you to be able to get to a place where you're writing music at a higher level conceptually. Once you've established these lists, once you feel that your palette is ready for the composing, you should start thinking about form. So in the next lesson, I'm going to talk about form. See you in the next video.